Okay, Shaul, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to start. Good afternoon, at least for most of you, and that's the afternoon part, not the good part. We're in different time zones, obviously. My name is Dan Cederbaum, and I have the privilege of being the executive director of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program, Rabbi Dr. Shaul Magid on Meir Kahane, an American Jewish radical. On a sort of personal note, let me begin by saying we hope that all of you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. There's an old Yiddish saying, a proverb that goes something like, in English, people plan, God laughs. One of my mottos these days is, God plans, people adapt. So that is what we are trying to do as we have moved these programs from the Washington, D.C. area, where we had very much hoped to be last week. And it's great to see people there. I will say before I continue, though, somebody just took control of the screen, Lewis, I think. So
Yes.
Lewis needs to release the screen, although it won't affect the audio, since he is sharing the screen accidentally. This is one little glitch sometimes with Zoom, but I'll go on. You can still hear me, I trust. Organized at the end of 2010 and based in Evanston, Illinois, the Kaplan Center is a not-for-profit organization devoted to the transformation of Jewish community through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century. The Kaplan Center's perspective is explicitly trans-denominational, and as such, to say something that may sound silly, but I want to make very clear, the Kaplan Center has no Kahanist leanings. And I am not sure I know anyone whose views on Israel are as far from Meir Kahane as are those of Shaul Magid. That, of course, leaves the question, which a couple of people have already asked, as to why we think spending time this afternoon talking about Kahane is worth your time. And that is a question that I know Shaul will address. I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some of my colleagues. It's hard to do this without the clear gallery view, but among my professional colleagues from the Kaplan Center who are either on now or expected to be on are Dr. Mel Skult, Kaplan's preeminent biographer, Rabbi Dr. Jeffrey Shine, our senior educational consultant, and more to come from Jeffrey in terms of Zoom programs on education, as well as Dr. Eric Kaplan from McGill in Montreal, and Rabbi Dr. Rachel Sabbath, as it is in the US, Beit Halachmi, who I think will be joining us as well. And I'm expecting from our board, Jane Susswine, perhaps Jack Wolofsky as well. And I always have to acknowledge our esteemed honorary director, Miriam Eisenstein, and her wife, Carol Stern, who are on as well. So someone once asked me why the Kaplan Center does so many programs with Shaul Magid. There are a number of answers, but one of them is he's a total pleasure to work with. So, and the other major one you'll hear this afternoon, which is he's always interesting. And as we said in one of the flyers, one of the most knowledgeable and provocative Jewish scholars and public intellectuals in the world today. And we meet here today on shortly before, he'll tell us exactly how much before, the publication of his new biography, Meir Kahane, an American Jewish Radical, about to be published by Princeton University Press. And if you tell me you would like it, I will arrange to get discount coupons. They're not yet available for anybody who would like to buy the book. I have posted the Kaplan Center web address in the chat room. You can reach us through there, sign up for our mailing list. You can alternatively chat with me today and let me know you'd like to be added to our email list if you would. And also if you would like a coupon for Shaul's book when it comes out. So the formal introduction, Rabbi Dr. Shaul Magid is professor of Jewish Studies at Dartmouth College, Kogod Senior Research Fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, Tablet Magazine contributing editor, and rabbi of the Fire Island Synagogue. As many of you know, before he went to Dartmouth in the fall of 2018, he taught for many years at Indiana University in Bloomington. He's the author of 6 books and over 200 scholarly and topical essays Among those most familiar to this audience, I imagine, is American Post-Judaism from 2013, and stay tuned for more about that, because indeed, a week from today, we'll confirm this in writing, but we expect we will be doing another program with Shaul more related to that book. It is titled The Future of the American Jew, Mordechai Kaplan's Vision Reappraised. Many of you know one of Kaplan's most important books, The Future of the American Jew, was published, believe it or not, on May 1, 1948. Quite an amazing moment in American and world Jewish history and world history generally. And we're going to look through that lens at a number of the issues that Shaul particularly covers in his American Post-Judaism book. So when we come to questions, as I suggested for those who heard me earlier, please use the chat function. You could try again waving frantically, but that may not work. This is not a webinar in Zoom terminology. It's a meeting. That means no raising hands if you're used to that little icon. But again, I think what will work well is chatting, ideally to me privately. I'll see if it is to everyone, again, to Dan Cederbaum, and asking your question. There's two ways to do that. If it's short or you type very fast, you're welcome to type your question. If you prefer, just ask me to recognize you, which means I will unmute you when we get into questions and answers. Shaul will speak for a while before we open up for questions and answers. Finally, I turn lawyer for a moment. We are, as some of you have already noted, video recording this program. If you are uncomfortable with that, you are, of course, welcome to not to stay on, or you can turn off your video camera if you have it connected. However, in any case, you're asking a question or otherwise speaking will be deemed to constitute consent to our recording of what you say. So with that, it is again my privilege and pleasure to present Dr. Shaul Magid.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you all for coming. I know that we're in this state of kind of constant distraction, so maybe this program will be a little bit of the distraction from the distraction to kind of get us back to some sense of normalcy in terms of engaging with ideas and our lives and our understandings of where we are in the 21st century as a Jewish people. And so Dan asked me if I would actually present on the book. In terms of the book is, as those of you that know from academic books, it's a very long process. The book is basically done and it's going through an editing process. So when it will come out will really depend upon the press and you know where it gets in line. So anytime between next summer and next fall or something like that, it really depends. I mean, the book actually came in much bigger than the press was willing to publish, so we're in the process now of engaging in a practical aspect of Tzimtzum. We're trying to get it done. So the question, somebody had presented a question earlier on to Dan that Dan then relayed to me about, you know, why should I actually want to know anything more about Meir Kahane? And I think it's actually a great question. In fact, the introduction to the book, the title of the introduction is called Why Kahane, because I think it really raises for us an important issue about reinvestigating, or maybe investigating for the first time, a person who is a pariah for many of us, certainly for those of us who see ourselves within the boundaries of the liberal Jewish orbit. And yet, I've come to realize over the last 7 years working on this book that Kahane is an incredibly important piece, not of the history of Israel in the 1980s, where he really kind of played a much more prominent role, but actually post-war America beginning in the early to mid 1960s. And he really poses a certain kind of intervention that, in a way, brought me to realize that many of us think about Kahane backwards. Whereas when most of us think about Kahane, or when he's mentioned, we think about him as an Israeli political figure, a person who advocated for the transfer of Arabs outside of Israel, a person who was removed from the parliament because through a racist law that the parliament passed just for him, became illegal, in a certain sense, homeless, and then eventually was assassinated in New York City in November 1991. And we think of his American career as somehow a bit of a prehistory to Kahane, but I think that we're looking at it backwards. I think Kahane is most important as an American figure in the 1960s, who staged an intervention against what he called the liberal Jewish establishment. And we can talk about what that actually means and what he sought to mean. In a sense, basically, his was a kind of quasi-religious, and I really mean quasi because he wasn't really a religious thinker in America, but a quasi-religious critique of American Jewish liberalism. And in a certain way, that's where he's most important. That's where he makes, I think, a lasting contribution, which I'll talk about at the end. And I think it's also one of the reasons why he's such a failure in Israel. In other words, he never really succeeds to understand the Israeli society. What he tries to do is transplant certain identity politics, race war ideas about the problems of American Jewish liberalism onto the Israeli landscape, and it really kind of falls flat. Now, what ends up happening in the afterlife is the emergence of what I'd rather call a neo-Kahanist movement, which is what exists today. So when we talk about Otzma Yehudit, the Israeli party that identifies as Kahanist, when we talk about people today who identify with Kahane in Israel, it really is a kind of neo-Kahanism. For the simple reason, and I want to say something now and then come back to it, is that—
before you do, a couple of people are noting, if you could, I know this is hard and I have trouble with it too, just stay as close to the mic, wherever your mic is, as possible.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, and if people can't hear for some reason, please let Dan know. The neo-Kahanist movement in Israel today is an amalgam of what I'm calling Kahane and Cookism. And I want to talk about that at the end, but just to kind of, as a kind of, to telegraph, in essence, Kahane and Cook had really diametrically opposed visions of Zionism and of Eretz Yisrael and of Israeli society. And by Cook, I mean Abraham, Isaac, as well as Tzvi Yehuda. So what we're seeing today in Israel is not really Kahanism. It's a kind of mix of Cookian romanticism and Kahanist activism that has kind of come together and created this new grassroots Israeli reality. But I want to actually go back. I want to go back to the mid-1960s in America and to try to paint a picture that is the society in which Kahane enters into the public sphere. I don't want to go through the details of his life. I mean, you can go onto Wikipedia or any other kind of venue to find that. Libby Kahane, his widow, published a 2-volume biography, which is actually quite good, of Kahane. She doesn't really get into any of the theoretical constructive details, but certainly in terms of his life, it's very, very useful. As a way of trying to understand what Kahane was about, how he was initially received, his downfall in America, the reason that he immigrates to Israel in 1971, the shift from what he called saving the American dream for Jews, which is really what his book Never Again, published in 1971, was about. There's only, in that book, Never Again, there's only one chapter on Zionism. Israel does not play a prominent role. Israel doesn't play a prominent role in a lot of his thinking in the 60s in America, only it turns later on. To what ends up happening in the 1980s, a turn towards a kind of, I think, a kind of apocalyptic thinker that is illustrated in a number of books that he wrote while he was in prison in 1984 in Israel. But I want to go back to kind of, in a certain sense, the beginning. I want to read just a paragraph, which is really the first paragraph of the introduction, which really struck me quite surprisingly in terms of why I think he's important today. So this is the first one paragraph. That's all I'm going to read. In the early spring of 2018, I was attending a bat mitzvah in a Jewish suburb of a major American city. Since I know Josh Shanes is here, I could say it was in Skokie, Illinois. I don't put that in the book, but that's where it was. The bat mitzvah was at a large modern Orthodox synagogue, and during the Shabbat day festive meal, I was waiting in line at the buffet when I struck up a conversation with a professional-looking man, probably in his mid-50s or late 50s. He seemed educated, friendly, and not particularly ideological. He asked me what I did, and I told him I was at the Center for Jewish History in New York on a research grant. He asked me what I was working on, and when I told him I was writing a cultural biography of Meir Kahane, his eyes opened wide. And he responded in this, and this is a quote, "If you want my opinion," not that I was asking him his opinion actually, but anyway, "if you want my opinion, I agree with everything Kahane said. Everything he predicted came true. He should have just said it in a nicer way." And I think in a certain way, this statement kind of captured a certain kind of attitude that many American Jews have about Meir Kahane. Many from the modern Orthodox community, but not only. And what was so striking to me was the matter of factness that he was saying this to a perfect stranger. I mean, I was wearing a kippah, so he thought I was part of the club, I assume, but I was literally a perfect stranger, and yet he had no compunctions to hold back in saying what he thought about a person who was really, for many of us, a persona non grata. So this got me thinking in a certain way that this project is important because I want to make a distinction here that I'm going to come back to, but I want to make it right away. There's a difference between Kahane's worldview and Kahane's tactics. Kahane's tactics, in other words, his militarism, his advocacy of violence, and so forth in the United States and America, in many ways is simply a product of his time. He was coming into the world in the late 1960s, post-1965, the emergence of Black nationalism, Black Panthers. He famously called the JDL Jewish Panthers, but he identified with that kind of militarism. But his worldview, and that is basically rejected by most of us. His worldview, however, is something that I found has seeped very deeply into the American Jewish consciousness. Not by people who would ever say that they are Kahanists, not by people who would ever say that they believe in, or they advocate Kahane. The very notion of perennial anti-Semitism, the idea of what's become known as continuity, what Kahane called survivalism, the ambivalence about liberalism as a way to save the American Jew. These kinds of things are the kinds of things that Kahane was talking about in the 1960s and 1970s. The war against intermarriage. Kahane wrote a book in 1974 called Why Be Jewish, which was a book against intermarriage at a time where nobody was writing about intermarriage. In the early 1970s, very few people, Nathan Glatzer actually talked about it in the early 1960s as a problem that is going to come. But in 1974, he writes this book against intermarriage. In other words, many of the things that came to be prescient for American Jews in the 90s and the 2000s, both the aughts and the teens of the 2000s, are things that Kahane was talking about much earlier. And therefore, I think it's important to kind of get at this notion. The idea, for example, that anti-Semitism on the left is worse than anti-Semitism of the right. Kahane was talking about that during the Black anti-Semitism race wars in the 1960s, where he was basically making the claim that the left is the real enemy of the Jew more than the right. You can hear that in everyone from Ben Shapiro onward in terms of their understanding of these challenges that we face. But let's really kind of start at the beginning. There were really three things that exercised Kahane throughout his entire life. And those three things were racism, communism, and assimilation. Therefore, I think what we have in Kahane is a really interesting case of a person who seemed to bring together the Cold War mentality and the countercultural mentality at the same time. So, for example, his book in 1967 that he published called The Jewish Stake in Vietnam, which is a book in favor of the Vietnam War, arguing that if America pulled out of Vietnam, there would be a spike in anti-Semitism. And actually, Vietnam was part of a much larger triangle between the Soviet Union, China, and the Arab world. And there are many different ways in which he articulates that. That kind of Cold War thinking then comes into contact with the counterculture and the way in which radicalism becomes a kind of honorific, whereas now we talk about the radical as something negative. In the 60s, being a radical was something that people were proud of, people aspired to. He takes leftist radicalism and he uses it for reactionary right politics. So he mimics, for example, the activities of the Black Panthers and the Puerto Rican Young Lords and other leftist groups as a way to kind of create what he considered to be a survivalist program for Jews to fight against the liberal American establishment and the liberal Jewish establishment as well. So in order to kind of get at this on another level, we have to really stop for a moment and think about what was happening around the time that Kahane comes into public view. So many of you on this call were around for those times. Many of you remember many of those incidents. Many of you remember what Kahane did or didn't do. But I just want to go through a couple of things. A very important moment in that time was a speech that the Black militant Stokely Carmichael gave in June 1966 in Greenwood, Mississippi, which was basically the emergence of Black nationalism to remove whites from the Black nationalism movement. I know, Ed Kaplan is here, and Ed Kaplan's father was very, very prominent as the president of the NAACP. This was very important for the Jews because many of the Jews who were radicalized by the New Left after the Port Huron Statement in 1962 became disenchanted with the New Left after the Black nationalists began to exercise a particular kind of anti-white sentiment, and after this 1967 war, an anti-Jewish sentiment by its advocacy of what it called third worldism and taking on the Palestinian cause as its cause. What happens there is an interesting transition, and I think the best way to capture it is in what Arthur Waskow writes in his book, The Bush is Burning, that he publishes in 1971. Art Waskow has a chapter in that book where he talks about Jewish radical to radical Jew. And what he does in that book, autobiographically, is to say that the Jewish radicals who became radicalized through the New Left, after that Stokely Carmichael speech, began to reinvestigate their own roots, and their Jewish radicalism became their radical Judaism. Now, this resulted in a number of things. It resulted in the Chavurah movement. It resulted in the House of Unleavened Prayer. It resulted in the Aquarian Minyan. It resulted in all kinds of things that we know about in terms of the way Art Waskow, Zalman Schachter Shalomi, and others begin to kind of rethink Judaism, not by abandoning the radicalism of the New Left, but by readapting it to Jewish causes. What's often missed there is Kahane was very much a part of that. And many of the people who were attracted to Kahane were these radicalized Jews who then actually made their way back into Judaism, except instead of a kind of leftist Judaism, they made their way into a reactionary Judaism. And a good example of this is Yossi Klein Halevi. He talks about in his book, Memoirs of a Jewish Radical, and there's a quote that I want to read from that in a moment. So Kahane really enters into the public scene in 1968, founds the JDL May 1968 in response to the 1968 Ocean Hill-Brownsville New York school strike and the anti-Semitism that had emerged as a result of that. Many of you probably remember that. Albert Shanker, who was actually a civil rights activist who marched in Selma, who was the president of the teachers union, had basically kind of come into contact with a number of other Black leaders about firing all the white teachers in that school district and hiring Black teachers. It's a long story that we don't have time for. There was a kind of spike in anti-Semitism among many of the African Americans in that school district and beyond that were really focused at Shanker. And Kahane used that as an opportunity to found the JDL. So the JDL, when it's founded in 1968, was interested in primarily protecting Jews, right? So here's a quote that I'm reading from a Sunday New York Times Magazine interview that Kahane did in 1971. Kahane writes as follows: "When people think of Jewish defense, they automatically think of physical assault. And that's not all what we meant when we speak of Jewish defense. If anti-Semitism disappeared tomorrow," Kahane said, "Jews of this country would still face decimation through assimilation, intermarriage, alienation from their background and heritage. I don't think there is an ethnic group in this country that is more alienated from its background and heritage than Jews are." So it's important to see that whereas the JDL starts as a kind of civil defense group, it also has a cultural program as well. And that cultural program was instilling Jewish pride. Kahane called it Hadar, which he actually borrowed from Zev Jabotinsky, who was very much a mentor of his, although they did actually meet, but we can talk about that elsewhere because Jabotinsky was a friend of Kahane's father, and when Jabotinsky came to America to raise money, he stayed in the Kahane house. Kahane was born in 1935, Jabotinsky dies in 1940, so he probably didn't know, he probably had met him but didn't remember. In any event, the JDL, for example, its first action was in a cemetery in Queens on Halloween 1968, a cemetery that had been desecrated by African Americans in the neighborhood for years. So he took a bunch of his JDL people and they staked out the cemetery. And when the people came to desecrate the cemetery, they came out with bats and sticks and chased them away. And that was its first kind of success. And that was its initial program. The other thing that it did that actually gained a lot of support was it was responding to the white Jewish flight in the 1960s from certain impoverished neighborhoods. They were called frontier neighborhoods there, where Jews, mostly elderly Jews, were living cheek by jowl with ethnic minority populations, Bedford-Stuyvesant, Crown Heights, and so on. And the white flight out of those neighborhoods basically left a lot of these elderly Jews pretty much alone. And so what the JDL initially was up to was creating these patrols where they would patrol these neighborhoods. This happened in Brooklyn, it happened in Mattapan and Dorchester in Boston, it happened in South Philadelphia, it happened in a number of these neighborhoods. And Kahane actually received a lot of positive feedback from people like Emanuel Rachman, who eventually became very much a detractor of Kahane, but in 1968, he spoke highly of him. Saul Berman allowed a JDL chapter to start in the Young Israel of Brookline, right? So a lot of mainstream rabbis initially were attracted to this idea that Jews had to take their own defense into their own hands. And so this becomes like the way in which you have the radicalized Jew who now becomes a protector of Jewish interests, not from the left, and not really even necessarily from the right in any kind of discernible way, but just basically making the argument that that the Jews are responsible for their own self-defense. Now, to speak of the left a little bit, one of the interesting things that happens is that this move from Jewish radicals to radical Jews erupts in a number of different instances. For example, the Jewish Liberation Journal, Ramparts, Genesis 2, the Brooklyn British Coalition, a whole number of these organizations which were really trying to create a radical new experimental Judaism. The Jewish catalogs and the Chavurah movement come up a couple of years later. The JDL is really kind of part of that. And in a certain sense, what brings the left and the JDL together is Soviet Jewry. Soviet Jewry becomes, in a certain sense, the glue of Jewish radicals. And Jack Wertheimer and Stephen Cohn, some years ago, I think in an article and commentary that's entitled What Became of the Jewish People, said that the Soviet Jewry movement was the last movement in American Jewry where there was a consensus among American Jews. And much of this was the student movement to Soviet Jewry that was founded by Yaakov Birnbaum in 1964, but becomes part of the youth movement that brings these these things together. Now, I want to talk about Soviet Jewry because many people that think about Kahane really think about Soviet Jewry, and Soviet Jewry is, in a certain sense, both the high point and the demise of Kahane in America and the JDL. But before I do that, I just want to mention one more thing, and that is, there's one quote that I have that I can't seem to find right now, but maybe I'll find it in a moment. In a poll taken in 1971 in Look magazine, for those of you that remember, about the JDL, 1 in 4 American Jews had a positive attitude in 1970 of the JDL. Now that's going to change, and it's going to change in a drastic way because of one event. And I'll mention it now and then come back to it. That is the bombing of the Sol Yurak Enterprises in January 27th of 1972, probably by the JDL, which ended up killing Iris Coons, who was a secretary, happened to be a Jewish secretary who was working in the office. Kahane was living in Israel at the time, and he wasn't there. But this becomes, in a certain sense, not only the end of the movement, but the end of Kahane's legitimacy among many Jews. So let's turn for a minute or so to Soviet Jewry. As I said, in 1967, Kahane publishes a book, the Jewish Stake in Vietnam, which was as much about Soviet Jewry as it was about Vietnam. And then in 1967, on June 8th of 1967, Kahane testifies before the Congressional Committee for Un-American Activities on communism and Soviet anti-Semitism. Now, how Kahane got to be the person that they chose to testify is an interesting question. It was probably the result of his friendship with someone named Joseph Khurba, who he co-authored the book on Vietnam. Joseph Khurba was a childhood friend of Kahane's from a Syrian Jewish family who was a kind of operator in Washington. He eventually becomes a speechwriter for Reagan in the 1980s, but he was very much kind of within the halls of power and has a fascinating history. Libby Kahane in her book says that she tried to do some research on Khurba after he died in the 1990s, and she was told that he burnt all of his papers before he died. So basically, in terms of the importance of Khurba as a figure here, we don't really know. But Khurba was a person that was very important. Kahane, they started something called the July 4th movement on college campuses, advocating for Vietnam in 1968. So he's very much a piece of it. What happens with Kahane in Soviet Jewry, though, it's kind of fascinating because you can see this incredible rise to stardom in a way, and then an equally dramatic fall. What's the nature of the rise? The nature of the rise is that in 1971 there was an international conference in Brussels for Soviet Jewry. Kahane applied to go. He was denied admission. He ends up crashing the conference, asking to speak. The committee meets and denies his right to speak. There was only one person in the organizing committee that argued for his right to speak, and that person was Menachem Begin. He then puts forth a kind of platform, which was basically a platform of boycotting the Soviet Union and so on and so forth. He's arrested by the Belgian police, sent back to the United States. This makes international news. By international news, I'm talking about Amsterdam, Germany, France, England, Italy, the United States, Israel. When they wrote about that conference, Kahane was actually talked about more than people like Golda Meir or David Ben-Gurion, who was also at the conference. So in a way, what happens is that in a certain sense, he uses the media to his benefit to gain international notoriety as the person who really has the ability to push the Soviet Union toward releasing Soviet Jews. And the truth of the matter is, Gal Beckerman in his book, When You Come For Us, We Will Be Gone, which is a fascinating history of Soviet Jewry, says that Kahane could have completely taken over the Soviet Jewry movement if he had held back on many of his kind of violent actions. And I think that's actually true looking from the archival material. He certainly, after the Brussels conference, struck a victory. And March of that year, he has a march on Washington, which was over 2,000 people, which was the largest at that point single march on Washington for one issue in the history of the country, completely nonviolent. 1,200 people are arrested. Again, makes international news, and in a certain sense is riding very high because he, in a certain sense, is now becoming an American Jewish hero of sorts in the Soviet Jewry movement. Of course, it ends with the Uruk bombing in January 72. So quickly it happens. I just want to stop here for a moment. And one of the things that's so fascinating about the story for me is that the entire episode, his entire public career, is 2 decades. That's it. 1968, he comes into public exposure through the JDL. 1991, he's assassinated. The whole thing happened so quickly. The JDL, 1968 to 1972, that's it, 4 years. And yet within that period of time, he created such a kind of a splash of sorts, I think, both good and bad, that we're still talking about him in 2020. I want to kind of make a transition to Zionism because, there's a real, in a sense, difference between the American Kahane and the Israeli Kahane. And I think one of the ways of doing that is to talk about a really interesting event that happens, and many of you will remember this, the Academy Awards 1968. Vanessa Redgrave wins the Academy Award for Best Actress in a movie called Julia, which was about a non-Jew who is killed by the Nazis trying to save Jews, made it with Jane Fonda. The same year, Vanessa Redgrave, who was a kind of known leftist radical, also made a documentary called The Palestinians. And the JDL had tried to prevent her from getting the Academy Award for Best Actress. And I just want to read you what she says in her speech, because it's actually quite interesting.
Shaul, before you go on, I apologize. I know this is very hard. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
But again, if you could try to stay close in,
Okay,
I think you're naturally, and believe me, I do this too, moving around, and it's affecting the
I'm
sorry. Video there. Sorry.
Okay. So I just want to read this very quickly. Her speech. So this is on obviously national television, internationally transmitted. She says, "Dear colleagues, thank you very much for a tribute to this work, blah, blah, blah." And then she says, "And I salute you and I pay tribute to you, and I think you should be very proud that in the last few weeks you stood firm and you have refused to be intimidated by the threats of a small bunch of Zionist hoodlums whose behavior is an insult to the stature of Jews all over the world." This is referring to Kahane and the JDL. "And their great and heroic record of struggle against fascism and oppression." That was her acceptance speech. And it was followed by boos in the crowd, because everybody knew what she was talking about because the story had been covered in the Los Angeles Times and in the New York Times. In response to that speech, Kahane publishes a book the next year called Listen World, Listen Jew, which was his first real systematic statement about Zionism that will then become, in a sense, the program of his move from America to Israel. Now, he makes Aliyah in 1971, right after he is given a 5-year suspended sentence for arms smuggling across state lines, which he eventually served a year in prison in Pennsylvania because he broke parole laws in a number of different places. But that was later. He had to come back from Israel to America to sit in prison there for a year. But he basically comes to the conclusion that American Jewry is lost, that liberalism is too strong, and that assimilation is too powerful, and that the only possible way for the Jews to survive is this program of Mass Aliyah. Moves to Israel, goes to speak to Moshe Dayan, tells Moshe Dayan of his plan for mass aliyah. Moshe Dayan and the other politicians basically reject the idea because, in a certain sense, Israel did not want mass aliyah from America because the American Jews were playing a very important role in advocating for Israeli interests in America. This becomes the first conflict that he has with Israel. But he publishes this book, Listen World, Listen Jew. And what's important about this book is, well, I should first say the first printing of the book is called Listen Vanessa, Listen Jew. And then in the second printing, he changes it to Listen World, Listen Jew. Is making the argument that there is no distinction whatsoever between Zionism and Judaism. That the two are identical. That Zionism is not a modern movement for national sovereignty. It's not a national movement at all. The first Zionist for Kahane was Abraham. In other words, he wants to make this fusion between Zionism and Judaism such that one who is not a Zionist essentially is not a Jew. Certainly not a practitioner of Judaism. Now, this is something that you can hear even today sometimes, but it's something that was not very popular in the 1970s. This idea of making Zionism and Judaism identical is an interesting, to my mind, amalgam of secularism and religion. Because I don't think that Kahane is a religious thinker in America. If you look at his writings in America, there's very little citations of sources, very little about religion per se. In Israel, that begins to change. But the religiosity in Israel is really a combination of a secular notion of survival with a theological mandate that gives the right of the Jews, historically as well as theologically, to the land of Israel. In a sense, non-Jews have no right to be there. There is no program of national sovereignty or national aspirations for the Arabs in Israel. That for Kahane, the only right that Jews have to the land of Israel is because God says so. Now, there's something very interesting in this, because one of the things that separates Kahane from Kook, which I mentioned earlier, is that for Kahane, secular Zionism has no legitimacy whatsoever. In fact, he goes further. He says basically in a book in 1987 called Uncomfortable Questions for Comfortable Jews, after the Knesset removed him because of a racism law, he says that the secular Zionists are really the racists. And the claim that the argument that he makes is very simple. From a secular perspective, he says, what right do the Jews have to come and settle in a land where other people live? Even if you say that it historically has related to the Jewish people and so on and so forth, if you don't, for Kahane, obviously not for me, for Kahane, if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in revelation, if you don't believe that God gave the land of Israel to the Jews, there is no right whatsoever for the Jews to establish a state there. And so in a sense, what he's doing, he's kind of turning things upside down by saying to the Knesset, you're calling me a racist. I say that you're the racists, that the secular Zionists are the racists. Therefore, for him, Geula Cohen, who is a far right-wing Knesset member, Geula Cohen is no better than Yossi Sarid. The whole notion of right and left means nothing for him within the secular orbit. Now, this idea of religion as being the sole criteria for Zionism is something that in some way he shares with Rev Kook, but yet Rev Kook argued that secularism is a necessary tool in order to create the conditions for Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel, which will eventually be transvalued and overturned in the Messianic future. So that Kook is involved in a kind of dialectic where that which seems transgressive becomes necessary in order for it to be overturned. Whereas Kahane is not a dialectical thinker, he's a binary thinker, and he's saying, no, actually, There is no secular justification for a Jewish state in the land of Israel, which interestingly makes him very much in agreement of Yosef Teitelbaum of Satmar. There's a real interesting connection between Satmar's anti-Zionism and Kahane's type of Zionism that is based solely on revelation. So this kind of activity becomes part of his program. He writes a book in the early 70s called Our Challenge, which is his program for Zionism, and he begins to gain a following among Mizrahi men, primarily, because of his kind of anti-Arab position, as well as a growing cadre of people who were trained in the national religious yeshivot, who were becoming increasingly frustrated with what they saw as being the reversal of historical changes that happened after 67. Remember, after 67, Tzvi Yehuda Kook gets up and says, "This is it. This is the beginning of redemption." There's an incredible sense of optimism, an incredible sense of triumphalism. Jews begin in the early 70s settling in West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then what happens by Camp David I in 1979, and then the beginning of the return of Yamit a few years later, the beginning of a peace treaty, a lot of the people in the religious Zionist movement begin to see a kind of reversal of their fortunes. And suddenly the dialectical romantic vision of the transformation of Israeli society and the coming of the Messiah suddenly seems further away. And so many of them begin to become more attuned to or sympathetic to Kahane's program, which is, in a very secular light, the only ones that will save the Jews are the Jews themselves. We have to take it upon ourselves. We can't wait for any kind of messianic transvaluation. And this becomes the neo-Kahanist Cookian romanticism, Kahane activism that you see in the price tag movement, that you see in the Lahava movement, that you see in various other movements that are trying to kind of bring about the historical changes that the Cooks thought were going to happen after the Balfour Declaration and then after the war in 67. Once this begins to happen, Kahane tries 3 times to be elected to Knesset. He fails. He finally is elected to Knesset, only with 1 mandate. The year or 6 months after he's elected to Knesset, 1984, there's a poll taken in Israel by a reputable polling institute that says if elections were held today, Kahane would get 11 mandates. This then basically pushes the Knesset into action to legislate this racism law. They knew that they had to get rid of him. And there was no way to do it except creating a law that would make him ineligible to serve in the Knesset, which they did. And they made his party illegal. Interestingly, that law was never used again. When, of course, it could have been used again. Kahane claimed it should have been used against the Arab Knesset members who were engaged in racism against Jews, but the Knesset chose not to do it. So this was very clearly a way in which they saw this going to happen. At that point, Kahane really becomes a kind of homeless, I don't even know what to call it really, a kind of homeless prophet, kind of trying to find places and venues to speak in America, trying to find places to speak in Israel. I want to end on one point. One of the things that's very important that happens once Kahane gets removed from the Knesset, he starts to develop a theory of violence that's very different than it was in the US. In the US, violence was about 3 things. It was about self-defense. It was about subject formation. In other words, pride, that the Jew can say to themselves or him or herself, I can defend myself. And yes, you have to be afraid of me. And to create some kind of battle against the liberal establishment's accommodationist and assimilationist policies. In Israel, it starts to become more apocalyptic. Violence against the Arabs becomes a way in which Kahane felt that it would avert divine violence against the Jews. And he does this in a book called 40 Years, which is a commentary to mostly to the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel basically says that in the end time, if the Jews don't behave the way they should, God will act against them violently. And so in a sense, what Kahane becomes then is kind of an apocalyptic thinker, is that we have to act violently against the Arabs in order for God not to act violently against us. And this is articulated most fully in his book called The Jewish Idea, which is 1,000 pages in English, 600 pages in Hebrew, that he published near the end of his life, where he starts to actually develop these ideas from Jewish sources. Okay, just 2 minutes. Do I have 2 minutes?
Sure.
Okay, I know I'm gone. Why does this matter? It matters because I'll give you one anecdote. In 2016, in the Jewish press, there was an article by a person named Shlomo Moriah on Kahane's yahrzeit, which listed 36 Jewish leaders, most of whom were still alive, who spoke positively about Kahane. Now, just as an example, Kahane's funeral in Israel was one of the largest funerals in the history of the state of Israel. 150,000 people. This was after he was considered to be a racist and removed from the Knesset. The chief rabbis of Israel spoke at his funeral. Shlomo Carlebach spoke at his funeral. Many other great rabbinic figures in America and Israel spoke at his funeral. So this lifespan that I just tried to sketch out very briefly is something that still remains very much alive today. And my point is, like, for us, not only Israel, the whole Kahane Sadat, Israel is, Kahane was right. In America, I've heard things that Abraham Foxman has said, who is no Kahanist, that Kahane would have agreed with 100%. I hear things that many people on the religious right in America would never call themselves Kahanists, exactly what Kahane would agree with. So I think what the present day, for me, importance of Kahane is that I think that his worldview has seeped deeply into the American Jewish psyche. His attitudes about religiosity, his attitudes about Jewish pride, his attitudes about self-defense, his attitudes about anti-Semitism, his attitudes about liberalism. And we go along as if we've cleansed ourselves in this country from Kahane, and Kahanists only exist in Israel, I think is an error that is worth us investigating more closely. So I'll stop here, and we can have a discussion.
I'm sorry, there's not a large round of applause, but questions are coming in. So please, again, please use the chat function. 2 ways to do this. I already have one question, which I'll read. That's fine. Or you can simply ask me to call on you, and I will unmute you. So a question from Jeffrey Kaplan. Did Kahane utilize the Pinchas text from the Book of Numbers? Jeffrey says he recalls thinking he did, as a frame for his apocalyptic view of Jews needing to act to deflect God's wrath.
He does, but interestingly, there are two other sources that he uses even more than that. One is the story of Moses killing the Egyptian, and the other one, the midrash of Abraham destroying his father's idols. Now, as Kahane basically argues, Judaism begins with violence. It begins with Abraham. It begins with Moses killing the Egyptian taskmaster for oppressing or beating the Hebrew. So that, in a sense, becomes even more important for him than the Pinchas story. But he certainly does use the Pinchas story, yes, often.
Okay. I'm unmuting Ori Litzedek. Is that Shmuley? I'm not sure. Are you on?
Oh, no, this is Donnie Satlow. I work for
sorry. I just said Ori Litzedek. Sorry.
No worries at all.
Hi, Danny.
Hi. So when I was kind of hearing how you're describing the rise of Kahane and his thought, I was thinking back to the rise of Beitar and the revisionist Zionists in the 1930s. right? And I mean, for me, I found that to be a very kind of clearly conceptual link between the development of Zionism, right? If we define Zionism as Jews taking history into their own hands, right? With the development of the JDL, to me, those two conceptions seem very similar.
Right.
And specifically kind of how Beitar uses kind of notions of youth, right? How we, the young, strong men, are coming in to help revitalize Zionism and Zionist discourse, right? Those, I remember reading that in Jabotinsky's Children. So then my question is kind of, how did these two kind of parallel thought streams interact and play out between kind of Kahane and Menachem? Because Menachem Begin kind of very much seems like the young poster child of Beitar back when he was in Poland. So I'm curious kind of if that created a relationship and how that played out when Kahane lived in Israel and was a politician.
Okay, that's a really good question. First of all, Kahane was a member of Beitar Youth in the 1940s, and Libby Kahane says that in 1949 he left Beitar and joined Bnei Akiva because he felt that since the state already exists, Beitar isn't really necessary, and now we have to basically talk about the religious nature of the state. So there's clearly a connection between Beitar and Jabotinsky and Kahane. Kahane thought he was he saw himself as a student of Jabotinsky, and in many ways, I think he's one of Jabotinsky's most tragic interpreters in a way. But I think the interesting thing that he misses in Jabotinsky is that Jabotinsky was very much a humanist and also very interested in minority rights. So in a certain way, the people that Kahane came in touch with in America at that time were people like Ben-Zion Netanyahu and Hillel Cook and the Bergson boys, who were really kind of maximalists of the rights. In other words, they were people that were so right-wing that Jabotinsky felt uncomfortable with. But again, those people were all secular. So I think that if we want to look at that mix, I think basically, and I talk about this in the book, that the JDL is really Beitar mixed with religion. Right? But again, not religion in a religious sense, but religion as a source of pride. Right? He wanted to create an American version of the Irgun. That's really what the JDL was. Now, on Begin, it's interesting that you raise that, because out of all of his writings, he almost never speaks positively about any Israeli politician except Menachem Begin. However, when Begin actually gave back Sinai at Camp David I, that's when he basically turned on Begin. And he put out on Tainat Esther, the day before Purim, 1982, which was right before the Yamit evacuation. He put out a memo that said, now you see if even Menachem Begin can give back territory, then Rak Kach, right? The only thing left is really Kahane. So it's true, Begin spoke in his favor at the Brussels conference. He spoke highly of Begin, but the fallout was really Camp David.
Great. Next, David Goldfarb writes, quote, my father served in the Israeli army with Meir Kahane's brother Nachman in the 70s, perhaps the 80s too. Nachman appeared to be just as radical as his brother. Do you have any more information about family involvement in Meir Kahane's cause?
He wasn't as well known. He was actually working for the education ministry or some ministry in the 70s when Kahane moved to Israel. And then basically he used Nachman's, and maybe even Nachman himself, and this is a fascinating little vignette because he used Nachman's connections to purchase Uzi rifles in Israel that he then transported to New York for the JDL. And the person that was transporting them was arrested at JFK Airport, and they were arrested and brought to trial and something. So yes, his brother was very much a part of that world, as was his father. Obviously, his father was much earlier, but his father was a Jabotinskyite and a revisionist, and very much in line with that.
Next question, is there any documentation, this is from Thomas Timberg, is there any documentation on Korba's role in other public records, for example, of the FBI?
Yeah, about 1,000 pages of FBI records. Interestingly, according to rumor, and we don't really know if this is true. There was a certain point in the late 1960s where Kahane worked for the CIA, infiltrating into the John Birch Society to gather intelligence for white nationalists. That's a rumor that's gone around. Robert Friedman talks about it in his book. Daniel Breslauer talks about it in his book. Libby Kahane claims she's not found any proof of that. In any event, he was certainly involved with clandestine things. The FBI began to investigate Kahane at some point in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and those things are available online. One of the interesting things in Contra Intel Pro that I found was a letter in 1968 that J. Edgar Hoover, a personal letter that J. Edgar Hoover wrote to Kahane, asking him to begin to publicize that the Black Panthers were engaged in anti-Semitic activity. Now, Hoover had no evidence, that he didn't give him any evidence. He just wanted to use Kahane in order to be able to get the Panthers. So you could see already that Hoover knew who Kahane was, and that the FBI knew who he was. And yes, so there's a lot of material. A lot of it is blacked out, obviously, but there's a lot of FBI material on Kahane and the JDL.
I'm pleased to say we have a number of questions, so we'll try to get to all of them, move through them. Next, from Noah Leibovitz, if I'm pronouncing it right, what are your thoughts on the relatively strong presence of the JDL in present-day Canada, particularly in Toronto?
Right. It's interesting. Toronto was the first JDL branch in Canada. There were also ones in Montreal, and there might have been ones in Vancouver as well. I've spoken to some of the people from the JDL. Someone, I can't remember his name, Meir Shapiro. I'm not sure I'm getting the name right. Meir something. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I don't know Toronto Jewry well enough to know, what it would be in Toronto Jewry that would allow for the continued kind of popularity. I don't think that Toronto Jews feel the sting of anti-Semitism the way American Jews do, but it's a good question.
From Aubrey Glazer, you suggest an intriguing affinity between Teitelbaum and Kahane as Jewish radicalist thinkers who collapse duality and erase the legitimacy of the other point of view. Is this what leads to their radicalism? Is it possible to be a radical Jew and still hold binaries in tension?
I think so, yes. But, radical Jews like Teitelbaum and Kahane, and I think they both really actually constitute as radical Jews, are I think it's a complicated question. I think radicalism can hold that intention, but often it doesn't. It gets pushed very quickly into a particular kind of position that it remains attached to, that sweeps aside all of the nuance of the other positions. But I mean, it's good Aubrey brought up the question of radicalism, because I think that's a very important point, which is why I called the book An American Jewish Radical, that the radicality or the radicalism of Kahane is basically a critical response to liberalism. It's liberalism which obviously holds these things in tension, right? Jewish continuity and assimilation, right? In a certain sense, Jewish pluralism, Jewish liberalism is precisely holding these things in tension. Kahane felt that would ultimately fail. And Charles Liebman, in a book published in 1973 called The Ambivalent Jew, basically says the same thing, that the liberalism of the American community will not hold. They will have to make a choice whether to continue with the liberal program that will actually push them further towards assimilation. We can talk about the intermarriage rates in the 2013 Pew poll, or they're going to have to choose a certain kind of insularity that will protect them from that. So it's interesting that someone like Liebman and not a radical like Kahane will basically make the same assessment as to whether Jewish liberalism and holding those binaries in tension can maintain itself.
Great. So Michael Stein asks you to reflect on to what extent are aspects of Kahane's thinking still prevalent today, because Kahane himself was successful at promulgating them, and to what extent are they prevalent today because of the power for some people of those ideas?
It's a fascinating.
Would somebody else have come up, had Kahane not been there, or just something today that, at least in certain sectors, is part of thinking, people's thinking?
I think that it's a great question, and I think that Kahane's. Again, I want to make that distinction between Kahane's tactics and Kahane's worldview. I think Kahane's worldview is still very attractive, especially if you take the Kahane name away from it, and that is questions of the suspicion of liberalism, questions of continuity, questions of perennial anti-Semitism. An argument that's made, for example, in Ruth Weiss's Jews in Power, the notion of power, the way in which pro-Israelism has become such a dominant force in the American Jewish landscape. Those kinds of things are very attractive when they're separated from militarism. And therefore, the danger of Kahanism in Israel is the militarism. The danger of Kahanism in America is that it seems to flow underneath the fears of many American Jews about their status in America. And I think that's one of the things that Kahane was very strongly advocated, that American Jewry will not be destroyed by anti-Semitism. American Jewry will be destroyed by liberalism.
Okay, thank you. Our friend Rabbi Lawrence Pinsker, I think, would like to share a text. Let me unmute. Come on, sec. Having trouble with Larry's microphone. One sec. Strange. All right, I'm going to try to come back to that. In the meantime, Jana Kaplan has a question, so I'm going to.
There I am.
Hold on, let me see if I can. You got it?
Yeah, I think so. It's. I had a note that I had made some years ago that Kahane and Alan Dershowitz were both students at the same yeshiva as young people, and both were captains of the debate team at different times. And in fact, the two of them debated each other at one point. The then classical liberal Dershowitz against the then radical, in the original sense of the word, Kaplan, Jewish defender. And Kahane asked Dershowitz whether he wanted his kids to marry Jews. And Dershowitz said without hesitation, yes. And then Kahane asked if that preference was based on halakha, to which Dershowitz answered no. And then Kahane pointed a figure at him and said, "You are nothing more than a racist. Mm-hmm. There are plenty of perfectly good partners for your children in the non-Jewish world," this quotation states, "but your ethnic preference, in spite of everything we know about the worthiness of the Christian community, is that your child should marry a Jew. Dershowitz, you're a Fabrenta racist." And Dershowitz admitted he had lost that debate to Kahane.
Yeah.
So I am just wondering where in a movement in which it is essentially sanctioned and even abnormal by the definitions of normalcy having flipped, that Kahane's argument is that we are merely racists, but not prepared to take the full step of saying there should be no Jew who is married to a Jew if the only reason for it is as arbitrary as Dershowitz's rationale.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, the Kahane-Dershowitz debate is actually on YouTube if people want to watch it. It's actually
I didn't know that.
It's in two parts. I think it was at Harvard University. It's actually a fascinating debate. I mean, that's kind of classic Kahane. I think that in some way, what could have saved Dershowitz in the 1980s that didn't really exist yet, that has saved many Jews from that accusation, is the rise of multiculturalism. Mm-hmm. But again, I would say, if I was Kahane, I would have posed the question differently to Dershowitz. I would have said, do you think that Jews should marry Jews? And then and then Dershowitz would have probably said yes. And then I would have said, do you think that blacks should only marry blacks, or that Catholics should only marry Catholics, or that Latinos should only marry Latinos? To which, of course, Dershowitz would have said no. And then Kahane could have said, then you're a racist.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other words, that in a sense, that's where you kind of throw down the gauntlet. What would be the reason? What would be the rationale for a Jew marrying a Jew from a non-halachic standpoint?
Yes.
If you wouldn't basically say that, oh, people should only marry the same throughout the world. Like what is the nature of that Jewish exceptionalism? And that's something that we're going to talk about actually next week in the Kaplan, in the Mordechai Kaplan material, which he really addresses in a very, very courageous way back in the 1930s. But yes, thank you for that. That's great.
Thanks for the plug. Footnote on Professor Dershowitz, as some people may know, one of his first, if not his very first trial was representing the JDL, although I don't think Kahane personally. Jana Kaplan, who should be unmuted.
So, as a refusnik in Leningrad in the 70s, we knew Kahane and revered him for keeping the Soviet Jewry struggle alive. And we knew very little about his background. We knew that he attacked the office of Sol Yurok and killed the secretary. He also tried to bomb the Aeroflot offices, the Soviet airline. But those are the things that rang all over the world. And to us, you know, that we were alive because of that, because there was attention paid to the plight of the Soviet Jews. Fast forward a few years when I left the Soviet Union in 1981, and by 1983, I landed at Brandeis University, where this story comes kind of full circle. Kahane came to Brandeis to debate Al-Aksirad, who also was at that yeshiva with Dershowitz and Kahane. They all knew each other since that time. And I was at that debate where I saw a lot of Soviet emigre Jewish students were then organized into the JDL type of guard that was going so-called, you know, protecting Kahane and watching that no one hurts him. And I realized that these were the kids of the refuseniks that I knew in the Soviet Union who were in the Kahane camp. And I talked to some of them, and they said that that he was the only one whom they felt understands them and can really put them to good use. Otherwise, they felt completely unfit into the American Jewish movements of any kind and American Judaism. And it's not really that much of a question. It's just the point of information. And also at that debate with Al-Aksirad, Kahane does a similar thing with Dershowitz. I think that debate must have been in 1984, 85 at the latest. And he asks Al-Aksirad, do you believe, Rabbi Aksirad, or do you not believe that God gave Torah to the Jewish people at Mount Sinai? And Al-Aksirad says, I don't know, I wasn't there. And Kahane, practically at 150 decibel volume, says, look, this is the guy who calls himself a rabbi, and he doesn't believe that God gave Torah to Jewish people at Mount Sinai. To which Aksirad answered very well. He said, I can be a Jew without firmly believing it in a literal way, but I also believe that appealing to the most primal and basic emotions of people who are easily ignited is contrary to being a real good Jew. and it just polarized Brandeis. It was almost close to a fist fight at that point. And that's when the young guys, a lot of them former Soviet Jews, stood up and kind of put their bodies before the front row. So my question is, why didn't American Judaism find any use for the emigre Jewish refugee youth? They were so full of energy. They were so willing to take some place in American Judaism, and the only venue was through Kahane and JDL.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very good question. And the Soviet Jewry, I have a chapter on communism in Vietnam, Soviet Jewry communism in Vietnam that talks about this a lot. It's a great anecdote. I could talk about some of the other debates he had, one with Yitz Greenberg in Avi Weiss's shul that's also on YouTube, and then I have an essay coming out about. He was an expert debater in that way. Not that he was particularly prepared, but because he thought in such binary categories, it was very easy for him to kind of throw those things out. Before I get to I try to respond to your question. The Soviet Jewry movement is founded in 1964 by Yaakov Birnbaum. In 1964, Kahane writes a short essay called To Save Soviet Jewry. After that essay, he writes nothing until the end of 1969. The question is, why does Kahane wait from 1964 to 1969 to get involved in Soviet Jewry? So we don't really know the answer to it. Some people say that actually this was a way that Kahane felt he was able to keep the JDL relevant because the race wars were ending by the end of 1969, and the Soviet Jewry movement was kind of hobbling along with this kind of diplomacy, this diplomacy program, and Kahane felt that he could really take it into another, or put it into another gear and get it on the front pages of the newspapers, which he actually did. So I think he cared about Soviet Jewry. I think there was also something somewhat opportunistic about it as well. Just one anecdote before, by 1970 and 1971, you had the ambassador to the Soviet Union and the president of the United States sitting in the Oval Office talking about Meir Kahane and the JDL. I mean, it's unfathomable when you think about it. You have two of the biggest world powers in the world that are basically talking about this rabbi and a bunch of young thugs who are threatening Soviet diplomats, who are bombing Soviet places, who are protesting against Soviet performances. So in a sense, what Kahane did was he used the militarism of the far left, the way the Black Panthers were able to use it in the late 60s, against the Soviet Union. And in many cases, it actually worked. Now, what would have happened had there not been Kahane in the Soviet Jewry movement? Would refuseniks have been let out when they were, as easy as they were? We don't know that, but I've heard other stories from Soviet dissidents who basically said when they were in the Soviet Union, the one name that they actually knew was Meir Kahane. So I think you're right about that. In terms of the question of the absorption of Soviet emigres to the United States and why there wasn't anything more provided for them, that's a fascinating question. I don't really, beyond my purview in terms of answering it, but I think it's interesting that that many of the young people who came to America, who settled in places like Brighton Beach and other areas where there were large enclaves of Soviet Jews, were very drawn to the JDL for precisely that reason. And that's true, by the way, in Israel as well. So I think your question is a great one, but it's really a question to the American Jewish establishment, as Kahane would say. If they wanted the Soviet Jews out of the Soviet Union so much, why didn't they create a space for them in the United States? But I'm not really equipped to answer that.
Great. So we have just about 10 minutes. I don't want to stretch people's time online too much in these days of being online so much. So I'm going to move. Maybe we can try to the extent these are answerable quickly. I'll tick off the next few questions. There are only a few more. First, from Yael Unterman, What is the rationale or logic in saying that if the Jews are violent towards the Arabs, God will not be violent to the Jews? To imply that God's sole will for the Jews is not serving God, mitzvot, or moral integrity, but only to be violent toward Arabs sounds theologically completely unsound.
Well, I mean, to get an answer to that, we'd have to sit down with the book of Ezekiel, and particularly the way that Kahane reads it. But the book of Ezekiel, as many of you know, is not a very pretty book. It's a very violent book. And the violence is not only against the nations, the violence is also against the Jews, the wrath against the Jews. So in a certain sense, you know, to look at his book called 40 Years, which was the title of the book, which is that kind of like small commentary to Ezekiel, there is really an interesting argument to make about the fact that if Jews aren't acting in a way that is going to create the conditions for their redemption, that God will do it for them, right? So, you know, the category might be about, you know, in the Talmud, there are two categories that, you know, that redemption will either come in its time, or it will come, meaning if the Israelites if the Jews don't do what they're supposed to do, or it will come through schut, through merit, the Jews' merit. And if it comes in its time, it's going to be catastrophic. It's going to be violent. So in a certain sense, what Kahane is saying, to avert the catastrophic redemption in which many Jews will die, the Jews have to act violently toward the Arabs to remove them, which is for him an act of purification, right? To purify the land from the defiled nature of the Arab minority in order to, in a sense, deflect the violence of the catastrophic redemption in order to merit redemption by means of schut. Now, I'm not advocating this position. I'm just saying this is what he argued. And I will say that there is a reading of that text that could support that particular attitude.
Right. Menachem Kalas asks or says, I recall the JDL from my yeshiva high school days as populated by racists who detested African Americans. Do you think Kahane was personally a racist as to African Americans?
That's a fascinating question. I have a long chapter on race. It's really the longest chapter in the book. It's something that I didn't really get to, but it's really worth a whole separate talk. I would say that obviously the language of racism or anti-Semitism was thrown out, you know, is this person an anti-Semite? Is this person a racist? How we define those terms. Clearly, Kahane was an expert at the grammar of racism. He certainly used the grammar of racism to his benefit. Whether he held that, I mean, what would a racist really mean? That this race is inferior to that race? I mean, he has an article he wrote in the Jewish press called My Brother Solomon, which is about a black convert to Judaism, where he says that this person is as Jewish as anybody else, and I would happily marry them. You know, I would happily have them marry my daughter. So how could you call me a racist? So the question of race is an incredibly complicated one, whether Jews are a race, what racism means. But I will say to Menachem, who was an old friend for many, many years, he certainly was a master of the grammar of racism. And that he used to his benefit in terms of gathering together groups of people young Jews who were actually raised with these racist attitudes, not because they learned them from Kahane, but because they learned them from the homes that they grew up in. So I think the problem of racism in American Jewry is not Meir Kahane. The problem of racism in American Jewry is American Jewry.
So Don Sable asks, you please speak about whether you think Rabbi Kahane could have found a comfortable place in Beirut or Likud when he first moved to Israel and thus had more influence in Israel as part of the quote establishment.
It's a great question, because one of the interesting things about Kahane is here you have this guy, 1971, moves with his family to Israel. You would say, okay, that's his dream. I'm going to be in Israel. I'm going to absorb. I'm going to have klita. I'm going to be part of the country. I want to have a political career. You would think that he would actually kind of move into the system, and he had connections. He knew Menachem Begin, knew Gula Cohen, people like that. But he doesn't do that. He moves in 1971. By October 1972, he's already been arrested like 20 times. for all kinds of infractions, weapons, inciting violence, and so on. So in a certain sense, and this is why I think that Kahane is not a Zionist, really. Zionism meant only what it meant to him. So he really wanted to transvalue the whole society. He had dreams of being prime minister. He had dreams of setting up a theocracy. So instead of actually doing precisely what the questioner said, why not move to Israel, get involved in a political party? He couldn't get involved in Chirut Likud. He didn't believe in secular Zionism. He didn't believe it was viable. He was really a revolutionary who was out to overturn the entire Zionist establishment the way he was trying to undermine the entire American Jewish establishment. That's why on some level, it's the same program. The liberal American Jewish establishment becomes the Zionist establishment. The African Americans become the Arabs. You can go down the list of the way in which everything that he thought about American Jewry, he transferred into the Israeli context, which didn't work because Israel is a much different kind of society for obvious reasons.
Great. Important question from, they're all important, but this is particularly intriguing from Isaac Brazeloff, if I'm pronouncing it right. Can you speak about Kahane's views on women? I know there have been a few women chairs of the JDL, and I'm interested in women both in the rank and file of the JDL and in terms of Kahane's views on women, both religiously and politically.
That's a great question, too. I thought about that in terms of writing the book, and I wasn't able to actually get enough at it. I think that by and large, the JDL was a men's club, or I should say really a boys' club. It was made up mostly of high school students. If you read Yossi Klein Halevi's Memoir of a Jewish Extremist, you see that very clear. Women played roles, but they played subsidiary roles. Remember, we're talking about 1968. We haven't even gotten to second wave feminism yet, right? We haven't gotten to we haven't really gotten to the kind of feminist movement that would have required their room to be made in the JDL for that. So it's very hard to say. I don't really know the answer to that. I don't think that he certainly didn't write much about it. Now, there's a famous story of him having a mistress, and he did have a mistress who eventually broke up with, who committed suicide. It was on the front page of the Daily News, the New York Daily News. I mean, there was a whole story about that. And not only that, but after she committed suicide, he set up a foundation in her name, a fundraising foundation in her name. So that's as far as really I can go with that. It really is a good question. I just don't have any much to say about it.
Okay. Next from Phil G. That's all I've had. I've heard anecdotally that when Kahane spoke at Yeshiva University, it was very controversial, and that Rav Soloveitchik was not supportive. When did this shift occur in modern Orthodoxy? I get the sense that it was post-Oslo. I think you touched on a little of this earlier. Right?
No, that's a very good question. It's true that it was controversial. However, Yeshiva University was one of the few places that allowed him to speak after he was ousted from the Knesset. He spoke in Yeshiva University in 1988, 1989. So the invitation still came, even afterward, forgetting about in the 1970s. I think that Kahane was not really a product of modern Orthodoxy. He studied in the Meir Yeshiva. He didn't study at Yeshiva University. He used to go, as he writes in a letter, to hear Reb Soloveitchik speak in the 1960s. So he had some kind of connection. But he doesn't really emerge from the modern Orthodox orbit, although what ends up happening by the mid-1970s and then late 1970s and 1980s, the modern Orthodox community becomes a base for his support. And this is largely, I think, the result of his influence in Israel rather than his influence in America. Many of the people who were part of the JDL, as Menachem Kahler said earlier, were from yeshivas in Brooklyn, from Yeshiva Flatbush, where he studied, where Al Axelrod studied, where Chaim Bravender studied, where Leon Wieseltier studied, where Baruch Goldstein studied, right? So there's an interesting history of Yeshiva Flatbush in terms of the, and Alan Dershowitz as well, in terms of what it produced. But I was surprised to see that he was invited to Yeshiva University that late. at that point, Reb Soloveitchik was really already ill and really no longer a part of the institution on any kind of day-to-day basis. But there is a real, and there's a base of support of Kahanis today in Yeshiva University. So I think it's a complicated story, but it was problematic when Soloveitchik was alive and was very much a part of the day-to-day running of Yeshiva.
Great. Two last questions, and I think we can get them in. So one, I'm going to summarize a little bit from, and it's just, again, an abbreviation, Judah Ken, is to talk just for briefly, and it sounds like a much bigger discussion to do it justice, on the internal community organizing aspects of the JDL. In other words, not the external context or the ideology so much as how the movement was built, and where, I guess maybe part of what the questioner is getting at is, were there exceptional community building skills exhibited in creating this assemblage?
Well, from what I'm able to gather, again, not having been there, but from archival material and so on, it seemed to be a kind of slapdash organization. It was founded by three people: Meir Kahane, Bertrand Zweiban, who was at that point in his 30s or 40s, who was a lawyer, and Marty Dolgan. Those are the three people who founded it. It was on a shoe. It was really functioned on a shoestring. They would have mimeographed newsletters, but the newsletters came out pretty regularly. Actually, it didn't seem to have much of a financial base. It was run out of. At sometimes there was an office in Brooklyn. Sometimes there was an office in Manhattan. Descriptions of what life looked like institutionally in the JDL during those years. You can look at Yossi Klein Halevi's a memoir, which talks about it in great detail. But it was really basically run by high school students for the most part. And Kahane was always traveling, so he was always in and out. So I don't really get a sense that there was a whole lot of organization.
Well, last question, I'm going to unmute everybody to say, and I'm not making this up, the last question really more for me is, will you do more programs with Dr. Magid? Yes. Starting, yes. And that was the answer I think the questioner was looking for. So starting next week. Stay tuned, everyone. With that, let me just thank Shaul for a wonderful presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Again, please be in touch if you want information about next week and beyond. Stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Send us information on next week's program.
Yes, please make sure you're on the mailing list or send me a note here. Yes, it will likely be the same time next Sunday.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.